So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker joining us online. We have Alfie Robinson. And Alfie Robinson is an independent scholar who's interested in patterns and anomalies in art history. He's interested in how he's interested in art and laws and regulations, artisans and patrons, problems in iconography, materials and techniques. He has mostly a medieval focus, but also covers contemporary artistic and conservation practice. And Alfie's paper is going to be called The Persuasiveness of the Lindisfarne Gospels. So I'm going to mute Alfie. You're welcome to unmute, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, hi everyone. Thanks, Natalie, for that introduction, and thanks to MEMS for hosting me. Yeah, it's an exciting day. So my paper's called The Persuasiveness of the Lindisfarne Gospels, and it's based on a paper I wrote a couple of years ago now, which is published in the Journal of the Australian Early Medieval Association. And the important thing to get across right off the bat is that it covers the early medieval period principally, but it also stretches back into late antiquity towards the end of the Roman Empire, as we'll see. So let's change slide. Yeah, so the Lindisfarne Gospels themselves are a world-famous manuscript, probably one of the most famous, perhaps after the Book of Kells, of the insular manuscripts, so those created in the British Isles, in the early part of that period, written around 700 AD, or Common Era, and they were written on the holy isle of Lindisfarne, which is in the northeast of England, off the coast of Northumbria. And according to a little signature of sorts written right at the back of the document, the book is attributed to the bishop of that island called Eadfrith. And from this we know that the authors of the document and the people illuminating it were extremely learned and would have had access to ancient texts, like those of St. Augustine and others, as we'll hear. The book contains figurative imagery and abstract imagery, in addition to the text of the Gospels. The Gospels are, of course, the accounts of the life, works and death of Jesus Christ, the hero of the Christian faith, and according to Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, those four authors. And in the book we have portraits of those four, which we'll talk about two of them. And we also have this thing in the middle, this strange kind of architectural structure. And this is known as the canon tables, and they're basically a sequence of numbers telling you where things match up in the four gospel accounts. And on the left, you have this dazzling image, which I opened with, which is one of the so-called carpet pages, which I think quite aptly describes the dense network of lines and colours that you see, but obviously they add up to an image of the cross, and there are several different versions of these, and you can see it has that distinctive insular flair, using this interlace of knots. So in addition to the Gospels, there's a lot more going on. And my paper is about persuasiveness. It's also about memorableness. So I'm trying to convince you that this book is a persuasive work, and that it's also memorable as a result of that. And I will explain how and why that's the case. Why should a book try and persuade you of some kind of truth in this context? And that relates to the theme of this panel. Well, there's one fundamental reason why a gospel book ought to be persuasive, and that harks back to this fundamental issue or challenge within Christianity, which is that we have four different versions of the same events, of the same critical story that makes Christians Christians, the life of Christ. There are four different accounts in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and they overlap partially, but not completely, and they disagree with each other on really important details. And there's many different examples of this. One example that I think is quite interesting is how, in the moment where Christ is being crucified, some of the authors tell us that there's an abbreviation nailed above his head, calling him the King of the Jews. Some of them, it says it's in Latin, but in John, it tells us that it has it in Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. So this is one interesting image whilst Christ is being crucified, but they have slight differences. And this is a kind of, it's a trans-historical challenge for Christianity to deal with. But for us today, what's interesting is that this is something that antique critics of Christianity, so pagans who believed in what you might call, Greco-Roman paganism, found this out, and they brought it up in their texts as a criticism of Christianity. And this influences a whole tradition of Christian writing. That pagan critique influences that tradition of Christian writing. So this is how we're going to jump ourselves backwards in time from 700 CE right to 400. And we're also going to go about 2,200 kilometers to the southeast. You can see my line there is pointing to northern Africa, what's now Algeria, because the connecting thread here is St. Augustine of Hippo, Hippo being in modern-day Algeria. He's this connective thread that links antiquity to the medieval, and what he does is he takes ancient Roman oratory and rhetoric, the art of persuading people, and he kind of retrofits it. He bends it into a new form to work for Christianity. And one of the most important ideas here is this idea of vividness and evidence, or enargeia for vividness, meaning that you cannot resist the truth, you see it in your mind's eye. Augustine was working against pagan critics of Christianity, particularly Porphyry of Tyre, who's this figure on the left here, represented in a very late medieval depiction. Rather nicely, he's being instructed by a little devil on his shoulder with a bat wing, which gives you a sense of this antagonistic figure. And his writings are only preserved in fragments, ironically, within Christian authors' texts, and he says it is plain that this is a discordant invention, so it's an incoherent fiction, and he's referring specifically to the Christian story here. And this directly inspires the likes of Augustine of Hippo, and he writes two texts which are important that we're just about to discuss and their influence on the Lindisfarne Gospels. The first is on the harmony of the Gospels. You can see how that directly responds to ideas from Porphyry, and also on Christian instruction, which is a general rhetorical manual. Augustine says the following about images, which I think is a critical key into understanding why you would bother with images and why this would gel with a scholar writing in about 700 from what they'd read and giving them a sense of justification to make images. And he says that he describes the support of imagery, and then he goes into this interesting metaphor of the teeth of the church tearing men away from their errors, which is a sort of violent and memorable image, crucially. So these ideas move into the insular world through manuscripts. We've got one on the right. This is an insular-influenced text where you can see this very clear knot. And we also have an 8th century fragmentary copy from Northumbria. We know it's from Northumbria because of the paleography. The handwriting is very specifically Northumbrian, and that's of the Harmony of the Gospels by Augustine. So we have pretty convincing evidence that these texts were actually, the specific texts that I'm talking about, were in the right time and place to be influential. So back to the Lindisfarne Gospels. We have the holy men tearing us away from our errors, in the form of portraits. And so the first persuasive thing to understand is that these are images which are memorable, specific, peculiar in lots of different ways, which give us a sense of real historical characters who are telling us the truth about Christ. And I'm going to zoom in on St. John the Evangelist. And Augustine has a nice little kind of spark notes line in his on the harmony of the Gospels. He gives us an idea of what John's all about. And he says the following, I'm going to read it in full. Truly, John flies over the clouds of human weakness like an eagle, and with his most sharp and strong eyes of the soul sees the light of unchangeable truth. I think the first thing to notice is that John is basically an eagle already. You can see above, I've cropped out the actual eagle, and I've zoomed in on his face, but he has a beak-like mouth, and these piercing almond-shaped eyes, which look out at us and out of the book into the real world as well. This isn't repeated in any of the other gospel authors that are depicted. They're all engaged slightly solipsistically in their own work, but John is gazing out with those sharp eyes. So that seems to be quite a clear influence and a very deliberate choice in the way that it only happens with John. It's distinctive and memorable. The other thing is that Augustine refers to the light of unchangeable truth. Light is an inescapable trope in basically all of Christian writing throughout the medieval period. And here, John the Evangelist, he has a little nameplate that says, it's basically Greek, Ios, holy. All the others have this, but they're in black on the vellum. Whereas in John, it's this extraordinary glowing yellow and orange. It's almost like a cloisonné enamel. So this light of unchangeable truth is coming forward in the text as well. And also there's an apocalyptic resonance to this. It's referring to John's special authority as the author of what's now called Revelation, or in the medieval period, Apocalypsis Johannis, the Apocalypse of John. Now biblical scholarship thinks that this was not by John, but that's irrelevant. In this period, they very much did link those two texts to this one author. Again, something special about John as an authority, not just on the past, but on the future. So the Revelation is a kind of prophetic text. We only have time, unfortunately, to deal with one other evangelist, and I'm going to talk about Luke. So here he is. He's engaged in his writing, and above him, the symbol above his head is of a bull, which Augustine also links specifically to Luke. I should say at this point, by the way, that the four gospel authors each have an animal that's been attributed to them. This is because in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in Ezekiel, there's a vision of four animals, and the same thing happens in John's Revelation or Apocalypse text. And the Bible does not tell you how to link these to specific gospel authors. In fact, this is something that biblical scholars, people like St. Augustine, have to do for us later on. And initially they don't agree. But Augustine's selection of those four beasts is one of the authoritative ones which kind of catches on. Okay, so we have Luke, and above him is this hovering cow with horns. It's actually a bull, and it's specifically a bull calf. So that's, you can see above his head, it says imago vituli, image of a bull calf. The reason that Luke should be connected to a bull calf specifically is because in the beginning of the Gospel according to Luke, there's a sacrifice by the priest Zachariah. And Augustine tells us that this is a reference to bulls, surely, because that was the mode of sacrifice, the beast of choice in that period. And this is something that connects both antique paganism, so what you would find in the Greek and Roman worlds around 100 CE, around 200 CE, and Germanic paganism. So this is the paganism which was in the British Isles, particularly in England, before the Lindisfarne Gospels were written, about 100 years before and earlier. And in Germanic paganism, you also have these bovine sacrifices, so the bovines are important. And okay, so this is one detail that Luke happens to mention. The reason it's important, of course, is that this theme of sacrifice dimly foreshadows Christ's sacrifice. So the kind of apex of the Christian story is that the Son of Man, the incarnation of God, is himself sacrificed, and this is the kind of ultimate sacrifice, of course, which basically renders all other sacrifices, according to this Christian worldview, as kind of null and void. There's an interesting emphasis that's placed on the bull with a technique which, again, is not repeated in any of the other images of gospel authors. So in Luke, the bull is actually traced over onto the opposite side of vellum. It's slightly translucent, and they've exploited this, and they've denuded this bull calf, of its halo. And this is glossed by the text beneath it that says, Haec lectio in abdomina Paschae. So this reading in the week of the Passion, or Easter week, Holy Week. And this is really underlining the fact that the bull would have been seen as a kind of spooky pagan precursor to the real sacrifice, to Christ's sacrifice. And this gets us to another important persuasive rhetorical trope which has developed in the antique world. And this is the idea that when the pagans are talking about their religion, they might be doing that historically, or they might in kind of the time of Porphyry be doing this directly in a kind of argument. When they're talking about their own religion and when they're trying to criticize Christianity, they accidentally just show the truth of Christianity. That their forms of worship dimly foreshadow what happens in Christianity. And this is something we find in St. Augustine's writings. It's something we also find in Eusebius of Caesarea, who writes an ecclesiastical history, which Bede, who's a contemporary of the Lindisfarne Gospels, nicks for his title of the ecclesiastical history of the English people. That's why the title is so long. It's because he wants to take this line from Eusebius, this ancient writer. Anyway, so this is this idea of paganism that can be useful to Christians, and they're extracting meaning from it. And again, this tells us about the specificity of Luke and about his ability to dredge up things from the past and show their relevance to Christianity, and how they foreshadow its truth. One additional word, about paganism. So I've been vaguely mentioning that Germanic paganism was a thing, and that it has certain interesting similarities with ancient Greek and Roman paganism. But it's important for my argument to make any sense that also this kind of paganism would have been in living memory. It wasn't merely a literary thing that was preserved in text. It would have actually, because it was the time period is so short between Germanic paganism being dominant and the Lindisfarne Gospels, because of that, it was in living memory, which I think is an important distinction to make. And it means that there's a certain kind of anxiety about pagan ideas and a certain need to cement the Christian triumph over these ideas. And I've just got some examples here to show you of how we might see paganism being kind of just on the doorstep of the Lindisfarne Gospels. So Bede, who died in 735, very much a contemporary of the Lindisfarne Gospels as a work of art, understood Germanic paganism, I think, quite accurately. He describes the months and the worship associated with them. We have other figures who convert only in the first half of the 7th century. There's documents of King Penda of Mercia being a pagan well into the middle of the 7th century. So I'm saying that the Lindisfarne Gospels is persuasive against this memory, this preserved oral tradition and of a living memory of Germanic paganism. And also, of course, it's persuasive against antique paganism through that tradition from Augustine. But also, it's important to remember that these things which make the Lindisfarne Gospels persuasive or kind of polemical against those pagan ideas also makes them memorable. So that weirdness, the specificity of John's image, the fact that he stares out to us, none of the others do, that Luke has this bull calf traced over, all these peculiarities make the Lindisfarne Gospel stick in our minds. And that's useful whether you're dealing with paganism or not. And so that's a kind of, again, maybe more trans-historical, interesting thing about the Lindisfarne Gospels. Finally, I think we should give a tiny bit of credit to the pagan critics of Christianity for inspiring that very specific, interesting rhetorical tradition and this idea of this need to shore up the coherence of those 4 different accounts that they work together. Because without them provoking those Christian authors, we wouldn't have quite the same influences on these works of art and on the Christian tradition. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Alfie. You can hear there was some lovely applause in the room there. If you don't mind closing your screen now, and we'll just get set up for our next speaker.